What is up, everybody? Welcome to the podcast. This is Operation Smarty Pants, where our mission is to acquire knowledge and expand our minds. I am your host, Special Agent Ray, and today we are going to continue our conversation about the brain. This episode is part 2. If you want to listen to part 1, go check out the previous episode. As always, thank you so much for tuning in today. Stick around to the end for some shout outs from last week's episode. We are going to get right into it. So today we are going to talk about 3 important topics. We're going to talk about emotions and your brain. We are going to talk about trauma. And then lastly, we are going to talk about creativity. So let's start off with emotions. Now, if you remember from last week's episode, we talked about some of the different actual parts of your brain. And one of those things was the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is one of the most important parts of your brain. It does so much stuff in terms of emotions. One thing that it does is help with emotional regulation and maintaining emotional balance, especially when it comes to intelligence and resilience. So like if something bad happens to you or something stressful happens and you feel overwhelmed, the prefrontal cortex helps you to manage those emotions in order to express and deal with them in a healthy way. The prefrontal cortex also relates to inhibition and self-control. So, when you get those intrusive thoughts, when there's a little voice in your head that says, oh, you should do this, or that's a bad person, or you're fat and ugly, or go jump off that bridge, So that stuff pops into your head sometimes. It's not a part of you. It is just your impulses, your inhibitions. And so the prefrontal cortex helps you to regulate those and enable self-control so that you do not follow through with those intrusive thoughts or impulsive actions. Another thing the prefrontal cortex does, and it is especially relevant to the situation we are about to talk about, it helps you to understand and find context in social settings and moral judgments and behaviors. So this prefrontal cortex is important for understanding societal norms, making moral and ethical decisions, and it also helps you process and regulate information from other people in a social setting. So how does this relate to emotions? Well, basically, our emotions are heavily influenced by our environment and the people around us. We are a social species. We are a tribal people. We are not meant to stand on our own. We are meant to be around other people, whether that's family, friends, any sort of community. And in order to be a good and active participant in any sort of social community, you have to be able to regulate your emotions, regulate your impulsive behaviors, and you have to be able to read the room, as it were. You have to be able to look at what other people are doing and saying in a given situation, how they are responding to you, their facial expressions, and just determine what emotions they might be thinking and feeling and how that relates to what you said or what you have done. And then, are they responding well to you? Are they not responding well to you? Do you need to change what you're saying or what you're thinking in order to fit in this moment? And I know that can sound maybe a little counterintuitive to the sort of self-confident, individualistic, moral standing that is present in society right now that says, I don't care what you think about me. I'm embracing myself and who I am. I'm going to be whoever I want. I'm going to do whatever I want. You can't stop me. That sort of thing. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but you have to find a balance between the two. If you are too individualistic, if you are too self-serving, if you are too selfish, then you will end up isolating yourself from the greater society or the greater community if their values don't align with your own. But if you are too much worried about what other people think, and if you are too selfless, and if you are serving others or people pleasing, then you will of course lose sight of yourself and end up giving up your own unique individual traits in order to fit into society. So of course, either end of the spectrum, either extreme, is not where we want to be. We want to land somewhere in the middle. So that is being able to express ourselves, make our own decisions, be able to stand on our own 2 feet and stand up for what we believe in. But we also do want to maintain good relationships with the people around us, especially like chosen society, chosen community, your family, your friends. Obviously, you don't want your impulsive decisions to end up isolating you from the people that you love and care about. And so the prefrontal cortex plays an important part of maintaining this balance. Now, what happens when this balance falls out of whack? We are going to look at a case study from this documentary. Now, I realize now that I jumped right in and did not explain what we were talking about. I just assumed that you guys are listening new. So I watched a documentary called Your Brain, Who's in Control. It was published in May of 2023 by PBS Nova. You can find it for free on YouTube if you want to go watch it yourself. There are a couple of topics and things in the documentary that I don't cover here. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to go watch it and do your own research. So basically, last week we talked about a couple of subjects from the first part of that documentary. We're jumping into the second part here, looking at emotions and how they develop and present and are regulated in the brain. And like we just talked about, the prefrontal cortex relates to a man named Phineas Gage. So they covered his story in the documentary. I'm going to cover his story now. In the late 1800s, Phineas Gage was a railroad construction foreman. So there was a day, September 13th, 1848, he was working his job, working with explosives. It says here that a tamping iron accidentally ignited blasting powder. I don't know what a tamping iron is, but I'm assuming you need it to build railroads. That is a very physical, labor-intensive, I'm sure very difficult job. So this is, and dangerous, not to mention. We're about to find out how dangerous it is. But any sort of physical labor like that, building something, is super dangerous. So I applaud the men who choose to go into things like construction, because it is very hard work. So Phineas Gage, a construction foreman, was out there on September 13th working hard, and a tamping iron accidentally ignited some blasting powder, causing the iron rod that he was working with to shoot through Phineas Gage's left cheek. Okay, so into his face, through his left cheek, behind his left eye, and then out the top of his skull. So this man essentially, by his own doing, it was an accident, but it was his own doing, he sent an iron rod through his head. And guess what? He survived. He survived the accident. Gage obviously lost vision in that left eye. I mean, of course, that makes sense. The fact that he was not dead is a miracle. So he survived. And it says here that he was actually able to speak and walk shortly afterwards. So he made a pretty quick recovery. The rest of his brain was still intact. Obviously, his body is intact. He just lost his left eye, and he lost part of his brain. So this iron rod shot through, of course, his skull, behind his eye, and it took out part of his prefrontal cortex. So his prefrontal cortex was damaged. And it's pretty amazing that this goes to show that you can survive without part of your brain. I mean, of course, we know lobotomies were a thing. I don't know too much about the effectiveness and ethics of lobotomies, but it's evident that you can survive without part of your brain, although it does change you, and it changed Phineas Gage. So, like we said, it damaged his prefrontal cortex, which, like we talked about just a couple minutes ago, is responsible for regulating your emotions, regulating your impulsive behaviors, and connecting to the emotions and reactions of other people. So, for Mr. Phineas, with this part of his brain damaged, he then lost some of these more important social abilities. So it is said that after this accident, he really could not keep a job very well. It says he lost some of his friends because of excessive cursing and rudeness, making unsavory statements. Basically, he didn't have any filter when he was talking to people, so he would end up saying exactly what came to his mind. Those impulsive behaviors would pop up, and there was nothing, the literal physical part of his brain that would stop him from acting on these impulses was gone. So it says here that he had difficulty making plans and adhering to social norms, and that this was indeed a big change from before. Beforehand, he was a responsible, hardworking individual. I mean, he was a foreman on a construction railroad site. Being a foreman is not something you just fall into or just on a whim decide to do one day. Like, that is a difficult position to get into and to keep. So I would venture to say that before this accident, he was a hardworking, upstanding citizen. And now afterwards, there has been a big change. So not only could he not regulate or control his impulses so well, he did not have any filter for the things that he was saying. It was hard for him to make plans and keep a job. I'm assuming that goes back to the role that your prefrontal cortex plays when it comes to your attention span and self-control. Maybe he would be working on something and got bored of what he was doing. And since he lacked self-control and lacked the ability to concentrate for a longer period of time, he would just maybe get up and leave, or even announce, I don't want to be doing this-ish. I'm getting out of here. Not really caring what other people thought about that or how that would affect him in the long term. It was more about the immediate gratification of whatever he was doing. And like we said earlier, the prefrontal cortex also impacts the way that you view and interpret other people's emotions or reactions to you. And one thing that it said in this documentary is that he had trouble with that. He could not necessarily understand why people were having negative reactions toward him, or maybe not understand, but maybe just didn't care at that point. So when his friends, I'm sure they didn't just up and walk away the second he started cursing. I'm sure they were talking to him and saying, hey, Phineas, what's up? Like, that's really rude. Why did you say that? That's inappropriate to say to this person. You need to apologize to them. You're really difficult to be around now. Like, what's going on? Can we figure this out? I'm having a hard time being friends with you because of your behavior or the things you're saying. I'm sure that people communicated that to him, but because he lost the part of the brain that cares what other people think, then he did not heed the words of his friends or family. Maybe he didn't, maybe it wasn't even that he just chose to ignore it. I'm sure he didn't choose to ignore it. I'm sure that again, that part of the brain just is literally gone. So maybe he can't even comprehend anymore what it means to take someone else's words and emotions and apply that to how your behavior is affecting them. Does that make sense? Do you get what I'm saying? That he just doesn't even know anymore what is right and what is wrong in a social setting, because his brain literally cannot determine right from wrong, that part of his brain is gone. Anyways, that is very interesting. And it is interesting how important other people's emotions are when it comes to our own brain and our own emotions. Because think about a kid. Kids are all about ego. Kids are me, I want this, I want that, I need this. If I don't get it, I'm going to throw a tantrum. And the way that you teach a kid that is not okay is by, your own as a parent or as a important adult in their life. You are showing them and telling them, this is rude. People don't like it when you say this. People don't like it when you take these actions. So you are training them by the responses of other people. You're training them how to look at other people's reactions, how to read the room, how to listen to what other people are saying, and teaching them how to take that and use that to inform their own decisions and inform how they control themselves and their emotions and things like that. So again, it just goes back to how important it is, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, I'm just thinking about the Live to 100 episode, how important it is to have a good, strong community around yourself, especially growing up, and then also, just as an adult, to have a good support system, to have good people in your life who will keep you on the straight and narrow. And even as an adult, things come up, again, we're stressed, we come upon different problems and challenges in life. It's good to have people around you who you can use to help you regulate your emotions. We are warm-blooded animals. We can literally co-regulate with other mammals, other human beings, even animals and stuff. There is a physical change, that release of oxytocin that you get, that calming of your heartbeat when you hug someone else. That's all part of your brain. That's all part of your emotions. Those are physical changes happening to your body when you are having a positive interaction with another person. And then you look at someone like Phineas Gage, who is now one step removed from being able to interpret and interact with and engage with those positive interactions with people. And then he becomes a rude sort of social outcast within his community when he cannot regulate his emotions and interpret and respond to other people. And we're just going to spin off just a little bit here. Society, especially in the West, has become so very individualistic and also isolated and lonely. We've talked about this too, that our interactions with other people has greatly diminished because so much interaction happens online. And yes, it's great to have this access to the world and this freedom of information, of course, but then people start to rely on that for their social interaction. And when you do that, then you're losing out on a really important part of being a social creature, and that is actually sitting and being physically present with another person and looking at their face and listening to the tone of their voice and interpreting their expressions and emotions, and in turn being able to express your emotions to them, and this bouncing back and forth, this bonding, this co-regulation that happens when you are actually in someone's presence, not just online. So that's just something to think about. I'm trying to relate this to the larger scope of the world that we live in. But let's now move on to the next section, which is trauma and the brain. Now, I know this sounds a little scary. We're not going to get too in depth, and we're going to move right into creativity after this. So hang on a little bit here. In this section, talking about trauma and the brain, we talked to a neuroscientist named Bianca Jones Marlin. She studies how trauma affects your brain, your body, and also your future generations. And that's what we're going to touch on here in this section, is how trauma can affect your children and your children's children as well. So a brief example, back in World War II, the Netherlands suffered through a famine, so a scarcity of food. Of course, this really affected the immediate people who were living in this time, living through this famine. But they found later that the children of these people and also their grandchildren had metabolic issues. And metabolic, of course, refers to your metabolism, which sort of encompasses any sort of chemical process that goes on in your body in order to maintain life, such as converting food and nutrients into energy, also building and repairing of your tissues, elimination of waste from your body. So your metabolism is essential to several bodily functions. And what they were saying here is that the children and grandchildren had issues with converting food and nutrients into energy. They didn't go into too much detail. It's more to say that even though the children and grandchildren of the people who lived through the famine were not themselves struggling with a famine or with food scarcity, their bodies were reacting in such a way that a body might react. Or, I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. Basically, the way that their bodies were reacting through a metabolic lens did not match necessarily the state that they were living in at that moment, but was maybe more reflective of their parents or grandparents who were going through the famine. So basically, your genes and your DNA and the way that your body functions and develops is affected by experiences, stress, trauma, ones that you go through, and the stress and trauma that your previous generations have gone through as well. So, and I think this will make more sense. We'll contextualize it with a study that I believe Bianca Jones-Marlin did on mice. So Bianca did a study where they took some mice and they exposed them to the smell of almonds, and at the same time they exposed them to some sort of negative stimulus. So they were giving the smell of almonds a negative, bad, stressful association. And what they found is that after a time of being exposed to this negative stimulus, the mice developed cells in their noses that had a more sensitive and deeper response to the scent of almonds. So the mice were exposed to trauma or stress related to the smell of almonds. And so then their noses developed, in these specific mice, they developed in such a way as to be able to more readily and easily detect the smell of almonds for the purposes of, I'm sure, being able to then avoid it in the future. And so they were exposed to stress and trauma. They had a negative stimulus or a negative reaction to it. And so their bodies literally, the makeup, physical makeup of their bodies changed in such a way that they could then better avoid that negative experience in the future. I think that's super interesting, especially when you think about that this is just mice and the smell of almonds, and then you take that concept and extrapolate that into other animals and into human beings, where the type of trauma and stress that we go through is so much more complex. Then you think about how our bodies change in such a more complex way in order to deal with that stress and that trauma and then avoid it in the future. And this isn't like a conscious decision that these mice aren't making. They're not thinking, I need to change my body to smell. No, this is just something that your body does in response to the environment around you. And I can say personally, as someone who has been through a level of stress and trauma and has dealt with PTSD since then, and because of that, it is like I do feel like something in my body, something in my brain has changed. I feel like a different person after having gone through those experiences, and I notice my brain reacting in ways to certain stimulus that are tangentially related to that trauma, and kind of like repeating old cycles in order to, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like these new reactions are trying to keep me safe from the trauma. Sometimes it feels like they are trying to have me go through that cycle again, because that is what's known and familiar. Trauma is super complex. The human brain and how it responds to trauma like that is super complex. I don't fully understand it, but this is just to say that I will give credence to this. I feel like within myself, yes, there has been some sort of physical change in the way that my brain works after experiencing some trauma. And so that happened to these mice as well. And they found that these mice then passed down those cells that were created to detect the scent of almonds. These mice passed down those cells to their future generations, which means that this trauma that they experienced in this study, whatever negative stimulus it was so intense that something deep in their core of self, in their DNA, something they can't even control, said, we need to protect our children from this. We need to pass down traits that will allow our children to avoid this trauma in the future, because it is having such a large negative impact on us right now. I think that is super fascinating, just kind of lending credibility to just how amazing the human body and human brain is, and any complex organism that lives on this earth, for us to be able to take our experiences and learn from them on a level that we're not even conscious of, and then pass down that learning to our children in order for them to have a better chance of surviving the world that we live in. And isn't that sort of the goal of any parent is to learn from your life and to learn from your own mistakes and the things that have happened to you and the things that you have seen and experienced. And then you want to equip your child with the tools that they need to navigate the world better than you did. Like, I think as a parent, we would all want our children to have a better life than we did, right? I mean, our biology, our DNA, the genes that we pass on to our children that is not under our control, that's what our bodies are doing. That's what our brains are doing on a subconscious level. So I think that's super, super interesting. And I think that what we can take from this is that we need to live the best life possible for ourselves. I think that, we talked about before, there's nothing wrong with going through hardship in order to make yourself stronger and more resilient. But I think it is best to, as much as possible, avoid heavy trauma like this. Well, I don't know. Trauma is unavoidable. It's going to happen. You're going to go through stresses in life. You're going to go through challenges. Things happen that you can't control. And if it happens to you and then you're able to pass down something to your child that then makes them stronger and more resilient to those traumas, then I guess that's a good thing. But I kind of take this, I'm trying to see this more from the light of everything that you do now, everything that you experience right now is going to affect your children someday. Whether you want it to or not, the way that you are living your life right now will have a direct impact on your children. So I think the takeaway from that is to live life as best as you can right now. However you would want your children to live their life. I'm hoping that you want them to have a good, positive, healthy life. However you want your children to live, then you need to be living that right now, because whatever traits you develop, whatever genes you turn on within yourself, however, you're going to then pass that along to your children, whether you want to or not. So make sure that you are the healthiest, best version of yourself. And I think that will give your children more of an opportunity to be the healthiest, best version of themselves. You're basically trying to set them up for success before they have even been conceived. And the last thing we're going to talk about is creativity. So this is a super fun, super interesting topic. I'm happy that we are ending on this one. In this last section, the documentary explored what happens to your brain when you are in a very creative flow state. Now, if you have not heard of a flow state before, it is the psychological condition in which an individual becomes fully immersed and engaged in an activity, experiencing a sense of effortless concentration and enjoyment. In this state, people can often lose track of time and self-consciousness as their skills are perfectly matched to whatever task they are undertaking at that moment. And this kind of results in optimal performance or a deep satisfaction. People who often enter flow states are like artists and musicians, athletes as well. Like if you're running drills, or I'm thinking about like a fighter, hitting a punching bag, going through a session like that. You kind of get lost in the moment. You lose track of time. I'm sure there's plenty of other activities that lead to a flow state. I'm just not as experienced with them. I'm sure you yourself have undergone a flow state doing something that you enjoy. It's usually something that you enjoy, something that may be slightly challenging, something that takes skill or effort or concentration, and you basically just lose yourself in the moment. So what the researchers in this documentary wanted to do was take a look at this flow state and find out what is happening in the brain while you are... I'm sorry, I had to burp. What is happening in the brain while you are in this flow state? How is it different from regular consciousness, if at all? So what they did was they had a man named Chris come in. I literally just wrote down Chris. I don't know if he had a last name. I'm sure he has a last name, but I don't think they said it in the show. So they had Chris come in, and he is a rapper. And what they did was they hooked him up to an MRI so they could look at his brain and his brain activity. And they had him perform 2 different raps. They had him do one that was already written, one that he had written previously and memorized and could recite from memory. And then they had him improvise. They had him freestyle rap while he was hooked up to the MRI so they could see what changes happened in the brain in between these 2 different raps, both written and improvised. If there were any changes, if anything was different, what was different. And they did find something different. What they found out is that when he was improvising, when he was in that flow state, just getting lost in the moment, his prefrontal cortex turned off. So this big important part of the brain that we've been talking about throughout this whole documentary, how important it is for regulating your emotions and your actions and helping you control your body and your mind and make decisions. One of the most important parts of your brain turned off, shut off completely. And he was just in his subconscious. He was not really in control. He was not making active decisions. He was not monitoring himself, monitoring what he said or what he did. He was just letting it flow, as they say, and his subconsciousness was taking over. That's fascinating. I think that's super fascinating. I think that's wild that you're literally like this is something that you enjoy doing. You're choosing to partake in this, and then at some point you transition from conscious control to subconscious flow. And again, you're no longer in control. You're just whatever's happening, whatever your subconscious wants to happen, whatever your muscle memory has, that kind of takes over your body, takes over your mind, and you're aware of what you're doing, I think, to some degree. But then this is where people say, like, oh, I was lost in the flow state. I lost track of time. I was here painting. I was just doing it. I was in the moment, and then I stepped back and saw what I had painted. Or like a musician sitting down and at a piano and writing a piece. They get so into it. They get into that flow state. They're creating. They're putting this melody together, and then they step back and there's this beautiful song that maybe they don't necessarily remember. They didn't consciously put together, but it's there. It happened, and they enjoyed it. It was something they wanted to happen, but there's a sense of control that is lost in the creation of this. And I want to attribute this to a personal experience that I had in the past. I was a gymnast growing up. I competed in high school gymnastics, and you would do routines. Like there was a floor routine, there was a beam routine, and things are moving very quickly. You don't have a lot of time to think. You're doing something that is dangerous, like gymnastics is dangerous. You're throwing yourself up off a bar, you're 10, 12 feet in the air, or you're, bending backwards over this 4-foot-inch beam. These are dangerous things that you're doing, and yet many gymnasts, across the world, myself included, are able to do them and do them over and over again. And one thing that was heavily emphasized in gymnastics and while I was learning new skills and stuff like that is you train and you drill and you train your body to do these difficult things, and then once it's time to get up and compete or perform and do them, what you do is you let muscle memory take over. You kind of step back mentally and let your body do what it knows how to do. And this is, I believe, the flow state, because your conscious brain, your prefrontal cortex is going to look at those bars, or look at that tiny 4-inch beam that's 4 feet in the air and say, nuh-uh, that's dangerous. I'm not doing that. You're going to get yourself hurt. No, right? That's a sense of self-control and self-preservation. But on a more subconscious level, you know that it's not dangerous. You know that I've trained my body to do this. The likelihood that I hurt myself is very low because I've been working hard for it. So you have to turn off that conscious part and put yourself into a flow state where you're relying on your subconscious and your muscle memory in order to perform these dangerous skills, because your conscious brain will overthink it. It'll overthink it and it'll stop yourself. And that's what happened a lot in gymnastics. We call those blocks, like mental blocks, where something in your mind, listening and learning now, it's your prefrontal cortex, your sense of control and self-preservation is saying, no, don't do that. But you have to override that, get over that mental block, and set your subconscious in the back seat, and set your consciousness, your conscious brain in the back seat, and let your subconscious brain and your muscle memory take over. And it worked. I mean, I would go through the floor routines, and the music would come on. I'd hear the music. I'd be in position, and then I'd start going, and then I'm just in it. I'm lost in it. I'm following the music. I'm letting my body do what it knows, what I know and what it knows that it can do. And then at the end, the music comes off. I stand up and salute, and then I kind of come back, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what a rush. That was so much fun. Like, I did it. I did so well. I wasn't even aware I was doing it, but you're in that flow state, and you get lost in it, and then your body and your mind are able to perform these fun, exciting, creative tasks or skills or endeavors. And then at the end, you're better for it. But that's my personal experience. That's the best way that I can relate the idea of this flow state and your prefrontal cortex turning off. But I want to hear what you guys have to say. I want to know about the times that you have yourself found yourself in a flow state. What gets you there? What kind of tasks or skills do you have? Do you enjoy performing that can put you in this flow state? I want to know. I want to hear from you. So please leave a comment, answer the Q&A. If you want, you can also tell me about it over on Instagram or Twitter. Both are at SmartyPantsPod. I will be responding to any comments on the post for this episode on Instagram or any of the tweets on Twitter that are going to be going out soon here. But please interact in some way. It really helps out the podcast. Let me know that you are out there and listening. I love to hear from you guys. After that, please go tell someone else about this podcast if you enjoyed it. Please share with your friends. That helps me out a lot. I really want to have these fun, interesting discussions. It's one thing for me to sit here and talk about it with myself, but it's another thing to actually talk to you. I really hope you enjoyed this discussion and enjoyed learning more about your own brain. I hope you got something out of it. I know that I did. We will be back next week with another episode, and stick around for some shout outs from last week's episode right after this. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you again soon. Ciao. All right, you guys, time for some shout outs. The first one comes from Apple Podcasts. Emanuele A left a 5-star review. Thank you, Emanuele. He said, "This podcast is amazing. Super good info." I agree. The second shout out is from Spotify. Ricky responded to the Q&A. He said this was a good one. Even scientists say we may never understand how the brain works, especially like the third section, which I believe was about split brain. Ricky said, how the brain works can be boggling. I agree, it can be boggling. It is so interesting that even now in 2023, it's 2024 now, but this came out in 2023 and this was new information. So however many years we've been alive, we are still discovering new things about the brain and how it works. One last shout out over on YouTube, SD Bratman said, fascinating, especially about how the brain communicates with itself. He also said that shorter episodes are a good idea. I can hit the highlights while inspiring you, the audience, to look into whatever documentary that I watched. Keep it up. Thank you, SD Bratman. I agree with you on the shorter episodes. I feel like this episode still went like 45 minutes. So I'm trying. We're going to get there, but there's just so much to say. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you for interacting with the podcast. I hope you enjoy these little shout outs, and I will see you again next week.